Or from a different time in life.
Good evening, everyone.
You and MMKR.
It is 6:54, and I'll call this regular City Council work session to order. It is our budget work session, and members of the public are welcome to attend in person. They may also choose to watch this meeting at burnsvillemn.gov/meetings or Comcast Channel 16 or 859. The public can also participate through Zoom by joining us at zoom.us/join, and more information is available on our meeting's webpage and in the council agenda packet. This is a work session, and we go directly to our item on the agenda, and we have one item on the agenda this evening, and that's our financial management plan review. And Jenny Brody, our Deputy City Manager and Chief Financial Officer, is presenting, along with Dan Tittner of Ellers. And so, Ms. Brody, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Tonight we'll be discussing the update, the 2026 Financial Management Plan update. Dan Tittner, Senior Municipal Advisor from Ellers, is here to present this evening. We've partnered on this financial management plan, I think, for about 5 years now. And when we put it together, we take information from the 2026 budget for this year, as well as some estimates of 2025 information and updates. Just a note, we are still in process with our 2025 audit, so there is some small changes that we do expect to occur as the 2025 information is finalized. But we believe this information gives us a good understanding of where we're at as we move forward with the 2027 budget. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Well,
Welcome, Dan.
good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the council, and staff. Thank you for the introduction. Deputy City Manager Rody, as mentioned, my name is Dan Tittner. I am a Vice President and Senior Municipal Advisor with Ellers and Associates, and I'm here to talk about, as Deputy City Manager mentioned, something of a spring tradition, the financial management plan for the city of Burnsville. Some of this was already covered in the introduction, but really to continue the discussion from the 2026 budget process. As you know, it is iterative and ongoing, and it almost never ends. We're always talking about budget in some way, shape, or form. We're going to review the financial management plan this evening, and also this is, of course, an opportunity for the City Council to provide any guidance or feedback, because this ultimately kicks off the development of the 2027 budget. And so as we walk through the various funds and some of the property tax calculations, we, of course, invite any questions or any feedback that you may have. So I probably don't need to cover this in great detail since we've done this for a few years in a row now, but it's just a nice reminder that the financial management plan is really a multi-year fiscal plan for the purposes of the city. It's a 10-year plan, so we look out over a decade, and we integrate various things, including the strategic plan and objectives identified by the City Council, any existing debt, anything included in your capital improvement plans, any future debt, which we'll talk about in a few slides. We model tax-based growth, and of course we look at operating costs, and we'll go into some more detail about operating costs also in a few slides. But really what we're trying to do is make sure that all the capital, maintenance, staffing needs, everything is met over time, and that it is in fact sustainable. And really what we're trying to do is determine if those costs are sustainable under a certain set of assumptions. And you've probably heard me say this before. If I'm sure about anything about this financial management plan, is that it is wrong. We are really making an attempt here to look around some corners, talk about the future, and really give the council the good sense of the order of magnitude and help you understand the impact that certain financial decisions would have on the financial position of the organization today and into the future. So we look at a total of 15 funds for the financial management plan, but for the purposes of our conversation this evening, we're really only going to be discussing 12 of them. The funds that aren't starred, forestry, street revolving, and improvement construction, they're all essentially doing their thing and they're in good shape. And while we look at them and do make some recommendations from time to time about ways to improve how they function, they ultimately don't really warrant any airtime this evening because of their financial position both now and over the 10 years that are identified in the plan. As you know, we always like to talk a little bit about economic expectations. The financial management plan and the financial operations of the city certainly do not occur in a vacuum. And so we take the time to kind of poke our head up and look around about what is happening both in and around the city, both at the state and all the way up to the federal level. Generally, the long-term economic projection for the state of Minnesota is slightly improved since last year. You may recall that last year the state adjusted down some of its economic expectations, and that resulted in quite a small surplus. They have now slightly improved those, but they do note in their long-term projections that inflation does remain at or above 2.3% over the next 5 years. And in fact, I believe in 2028, it tops out at about 2.8%. So still working in an elevated inflationary environment, and that's reflected in some of the assumptions that are included in the various fund analyses. The projected budget surplus, though, is about $3.7 billion for the next biennium, but the state also does note that there are several factors that create economic uncertainty. Perhaps most notably on this list, geopolitical conflicts. Of course, the war in Ukraine is ongoing. There is the tentative peace in Gaza. And then, of course, in the last so many weeks here, the new conflict in Iran and the various impacts it has on the economic status of really the world, most notably is expressed through oil prices, which finds its way into all kinds of things related to how the city operates. Of course, there have been shifts in federal fiscal policy. Tariffs is always kind of the watchword when we talk about this particular topic. That has changed a bit over time with recent Supreme Court rulings and then some shifts in how some of those tariffs may function and in what amounts. And then even though the state is not obligated to adopt a budget this year, we still anticipate there will be negotiations at the state level in a number of areas, one of which I understand was a topic of discussion at the council meeting right before the work session. So we will monitor those throughout the financial management planning process and, of course, make adjustments to the financial projections to reflect any changes in, let's say, local government aid or unfunded mandates or cost-sharing arrangements that the state may expect. The thing to keep in mind here is all of this stuff can ultimately waterfall down to the city in some way, shape, or form. And so we just want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on that and helping you understand how that may impact some of the financial decisions the city may have to make both now and into the future. We do make a series of assumptions. As I mentioned, I won't go through all of these in terrible detail, but the thing that is probably most notable on this slide is the general fund balance requirement. Right now, the city has the adopted policy of 40 to 50% with a target of 45%, and then generally anything above that 45% up to 50% can be used by the council for certain activities. We also model some fund balance requirements for the capital project funds that I'll talk in a bit more detail when we walk through those funds. But more than anything, we make sure that all the capital projects are funded by their respective CIPs. The thing I always like to stress when we put together a financial management plan is Ellers really makes no opinion about the capital projects that the council has decided to undertake. That is really a decision for the elected officials and the staff that assist you. We really try to model the financial management plan to make sure we're meeting the revenue requirements to meet those capital projects, operations, and maintenance needs of the organization. Of course, if the council is uncomfortable with those revenue requirements, then that puts you in the position to make decisions about perhaps what capital projects, programs, services, activities may have to change as a result of the revenue impacts. The other thing to keep in mind is we added a number of full-time equivalents based on the organizational analysis that the council prepared many years ago and then has updated really on an annual basis since that time. We also make sure that the financial management plan reflects your compensation philosophy at the city and that we do model additional growth within the community from a tax base perspective. And then, as I'm sure as the council is aware from previous presentations, we do assume that your revenues will increase about 2.5% per year, but your expenditures actually increase by about 1% more. And that does create something of a budget gap over time where your expenditures tend to outpace your revenues. And we do that in the financial management plan basically to make sure the council doesn't create any unanticipated budget holes. It's always easier to come back and say, hey, we had a little more revenue than we thought, we had a little less expenditures than we thought. It's much more challenging, especially from a council perspective, if the exact opposite is true. We don't want to put you in a position where we've overestimated the revenues and underestimated the expenditures and have you make some difficult choices in the future because you were relying on this analysis. There's about $150 million in projected debt over the next 10 years, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a few slides, but that is primarily driven by facilities projects that the council, I know, is well briefed on. And of course, if you had walked into this meeting this evening, you would have seen one of those facility projects earnestly under construction tonight, and you'll be moving into it in the near future here. And then the other thing to keep in mind is the council a few years ago actually went through a rating evaluation process with your credit rating agency, S&P. And so this plan generally reflects what we heard from them, and that is all geared towards protecting the city's AAA credit rating. Of course, you can deviate from that, but generally we received good feedback in that process, and so we do try to model that in the financial management plan to make sure that there is no considerations from a rating perspective. As the council is aware, there are several pending studies that are currently underway. The information technology plan was actually presented earlier this year and will be included in the financial management plan, also as part of your discussions for the proposed 2027 budget. There's a sidewalk and trails plan that's currently pending, parks lighting and security cameras, and then all that lighting that extends on the street, how you're going to handle any city-owned property, and then some discussion about the infrastructure trust fund related to some of your streets needs and in maintaining your replacement schedule, also your pavement management scores over time. It is worth noting that you also have a horizontal infrastructure plan that is not actually included in the FMP because we do focus on property tax supported funds, not necessarily the enterprise funds. The council does review a utility rate study, but that actually happens later in the year when you get closer to actually setting the utility rates on an annual basis. So after all that background, let's hop right into the general fund. There are new positions, 7.0 FTEs planned over the next 3 years, 2 in 27, 2 in 2028, and then 3 in 2029. For next year, there is 1 financial analyst, 1 patrol officer. And then in the following year, 1 patrol officer and 1 police sergeant. And then in 2029, those 3 FTEs are all patrol officers. It's worth noting that the 2027 organizational analysis identified a number of additional FTEs, but there are 19 of them in that plan that are not currently included in the FMP, and they will have to be the subject of future budget discussions in determining when those FTEs would be funded, and how they're funded, and of course, in what years. The thing to keep in mind here is that if we reference the chart through 2030, 86% of the new FTEs, or really 6 of the 7, are funded for public safety, and that 1 general governmental position is the financial analyst that was referenced earlier. So jumping right into the property tax levy trends, we do know that in 2027, the council adopted a few years ago some non-binding annual levy changes, so that is modeled in 27 at 7.69%. That does end for the property tax year 2028. Also, I would note that when you look at these figures, much of the debt that has been issued by the city over the past few years, primarily as it relates to facilities, is not funded by property taxes. It's funded by franchise fees, which the council adjusted last year. And that right now, because of the inflationary environment and some of the additional costs considered by the city, there are larger increases in 2028 and 2029. That is also to make sure that the city protects the financial position of the general fund and brings its fund balance or reserve level back to the 45%, which is the stated target adopted by policy of the city council. And so those adjustments, you can see the 9.44% in 28 and the 8.08% in 29 are really designed to protect the fund balance position of the fund and then also deliver on those strategic priorities, much like the FTEs mentioned in the previous slide. You may notice in 2030 that the increase is actually 0.064%, and so we would imagine that as the city moved into 28 and 29, you would probably smooth out some of these levy increases into that third year. It's worth noting, though, that there are 2 considerations that will have to be made at that time. One is the impact that it would have on your property tax rate and the interplay that rate has with fiscal disparities and making sure that there aren't any unintended consequences in that area. But then also, as I'll mention on the next slide, and you'll see really more clearly in the graph, the fund balance levels do dip to about 42% in 28 and 29. So if you were to delay the property tax increases into that third year, you would likely have to reduce some of those fund balance levels. certainly could do that. That is at your option. That would, of course, be a little outside the council policy that's been established to this point. But it wouldn't necessarily be something that would be problematic from a credit rating agency perspective, reaching back to my earlier comment about the credit rating evaluation. They just want to make sure that you're returning to your stated goals in a reasonable time frame. And we generally find that 2, 3, even up to 5 years can be reasonable considering the other cost pressures. So something to keep in mind as you move into 28 and 29 and 30 and figuring out perhaps the best way to feather in those levy changes to protect the financial position of the organization. Of course, it almost goes without saying, but I still have to say it, a lot can change between now and 28, 29, and 30, and that's part of the reason that the city has opted to update the financial management plan on an annual basis. So we'll keep revisiting these numbers.
Councilmember Keeley has a question for you, Dan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm just looking at the exact same chart from a year ago in your presentation, and 28 and 29, 28 was projected at 7.0, 29 at 5.5, and 2030 at 3.2. So in just 1 year, as you noted, things can change quick. They already changed. And I love the fact that you're using a very similar presentation because it was 325 of 25 that you gave this presentation. And so it's really easy to follow along this year's presentation to last year so I can kind of see what changed from prior forecasts. But you know, as we all know, and the audience should know, these are just forecasts based on best information. So right now, the best information points to a higher levy in 28 and actually, let's see, yeah, in 28 and 29, actually in 27 as well. Is that say 7 point, sorry, I'm trying to read it, 7.69? Yeah, it was 7 before, and again, 28, 29, they're bumping up. So it kind of points to there's no real relief coming anywhere. It's actually, the pressures continue to escalate even faster than they did a year ago, for example. Could you give us a hint as to why that's happening?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, there's a few reasons. The first, of course, is just the general inflationary environment. In previous years, we were modeling a lower amount of inflation, expecting it to moderate over time. In some of the funds, we have increased the inflationary expectations from 2%, sometimes to 2.5%, as high as 4%, depending on the fund itself. The capital project funds tend to have a higher inflationary estimate, and that's primarily because we are seeing the cost of construction increase at a greater inflationary rate than perhaps general services or other areas. The other thing to keep in mind, and you mentioned it earlier in your comments, is that the financial position of the city changes from year to year, and so we do look at those fund balance levels and then try to adjust the property tax levy accordingly to make sure we're remaining consistent with the council's expectations regarding your fund balance target, which is 45% of next year's expenditures. So as those things change, as the inflationary expectations have remained a little higher for a little longer, we're seeing more pressure on the property tax levy. The other thing to mention, when you were reviewing the numbers from the previous presentation, we had done a little more feathering across those 3 years in the previous model. You may recall that I think you mentioned in 2030 it was a little north of 3% in that year. In this model, it's below 1%. And that's primarily because we made the choice in the model to maintain your fund balance level at 42% in 28 and 29, and then get you back to that 45% level in 29. And so that's why those levies are adjusted. As I mentioned before, the council could certainly make the decision to extend the replenishment of the reserves over 3 rather than 2 years. You would just have to know that you wouldn't be replenishing the reserves, and then potentially how you did it, you could dip below 42% and get closer to 40%. Ultimately, that would be acceptable under the city council's policy because your stated goal right now is 40 to 50%. We tend to not like to go below 42% at Ellers for the variation that you just described. We wouldn't want to wake up a year from now and be like, oh, you're actually at 39%. You're now outside of your range because of the variation that occurred over the last year. Now, with that stated, we are still looking into the future. So even if that did happen, you would have time to correct for it. we just try to make sure that there's a little bit of a cushion between your stated policy goal and what we're putting into the model. And that if you wanted to, essentially, for lack of a better phrase, fly a little closer to the sun, we would leave that to the council to make that decision, not necessarily bake it into our analysis or any of our recommendations.
Thank you. And you're saying this is actually a forecasted levy for 2030 at this rate if we follow this and things don't move that much. It's 0.8% levy increase with all of the inflationary factored in, et cetera.
Across the 3 years?
Yeah,
Yeah, approximately.
yeah. So it's basically loading up the 3 years prior to that and then giving some relief in that year. Right? So I see what you're saying about we could choose to just not load it so heavily in those leading 3 years and take those down a little bit, but that would put 2030 up. But really, this is being driven off of, based on what you're saying, the fund balance. Maintaining that fund balance is with a little bit of flexibility, but still maintaining it within our stated policy.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, members of the council, yes, and that fund balance number is also driven by the subsequent year's expenditures, so that's where the inflation becomes a factor, because
Yeah.
we need to make, because you'll notice, and actually here, I'll jump to the next slide, because I think that'll demonstrate the point a little better. The fund balance requirements have to go up every year because of the inflationary pressure, because your fund balance is a function of next year's expenditures. So as the city adds staff, expands programs, faces cost pressures from just general inflation and other factors, the fund balance amounts have to go up. And so the property tax levy becomes a function of those cost pressures expressed as a fund balance requirement, and then ultimately what the levy has to change over time in order to meet that requirement. So a lot of moving parts, so to speak.
Councilmember Keeley, Mayor, Council, to Dan's point, I think this graph is helpful in showing the decision the council has made over the course of the past several years, really since 2022 for the 2023 budget, when the organizational analysis was implemented, there was a decision to essentially draw down fund balances to policy minimums, and a discussion at that time that as we did that, that would offset levy pressures to make investments in police, fire, other city staff, and that at the end of those 5 years, we would have to then address exactly what's happening with the green line touching the blue line in 2027 and 2028, with those the pressure of fund balance being at minimums, and then a strategy, to Dan's point, to start to bring those fund balance back to the targeted or more ideal space that really we would need them in long-term strategically.
Right. The graph from your prior year didn't change too much. It does show the out years. The unassigned fund balance is significantly higher than it was a year ago. The green bar was kind of riding the tips of all of those vertical graphs, right? Where here, those, our fund balance continues to grow year over year over year, and that puts some spacing between the green bar, which is, I think, the minimum. Is that? Oh, that's percent of total expenses.
Total expenses.
Gotcha. As a percent of total expenses, we start to get some ground between the total expenses and our fund balance with your new chart.
We did have some additional pressures. One thing that is different is we did add 10 or 11 SAFER grant positions, 10 that are funded by the general fund. And while in the first 3 years of the grant, we do get federal grant funds for those, the city does have to take the full impact of those positions on in years 4 or 5 and beyond. And so that is creating a little bit of pressure, additional pressure that would be different from a year ago at this time.
Is that, what year does that gonna first show up at?
23.
So it's probably going to show 28, 29 is
Yeah.
when some of that pressure, And we made efficiencies as part of the budget process last year, but it is something that is creating some additional pressure in those later
Sure.
years, 3 to 4
It
years.
kind of looks like there's a bump in that expense line in 29, from 28 to 29. There's a tick up, and then it kind of remains pretty
levels
flat
off.
from there. Is that likely where the absorbing
Yeah.
all of those salaries 100%
Yeah.
comes?
Yep. Yep.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I like to see at least a 3-year trend on even the predictive numbers, but it's not like the predictive markets, though. But just to see really how things are changing when you go through and you recalculate and you put together a new forecast, just how much movement there is from one year to the next. To your point, it can change over a couple of years, or in this case, it could change quite a bit in just 1 year. And I think I understand your rationale is inflation ended up being a lot more of a problem for a lot longer than what a year ago or 2 years ago it was forecasted to be, right? So you can start to settle in on a 2.5 or 3, and now it's not going to be there.
Councilmember Keeley, Mayor, Council, I think it's also important to reiterate Jenny's point that there was significant investment over a 3-year period of time in taking on those safer grant positions in the fire department. That was
7.
significant unplanned expense that will need to be operationalized by 2029 when the full freight of those positions goes from grant funding to local funding.
That's a really good point. I just want to close out. The majority of our budget is public safety,
Yeah.
fire and police, and because of the call volume growth of high single, low double digits now and then, year over year, it doesn't let up. And our population's aging. There's a lot more calls for service, and that's the reality that every city is going through. And I think people, mostly general public, responds to, why is my levy going up so high? It's because we're investing a lot more in police and fire, because we need it on both fronts. The types of calls have changed, and the call volume, especially for fire and paramedics, just continues to go up a ski hill. And that there's really, we're not going to compromise and save money by cutting back on safety. And at least, I don't think we are planning on doing that. I can safely say that's a
I
pretty
think that's dangerous to
consistent
think that you're gonna-
comment from our council members
Yeah.
that, and so when you have the majority of your budget increasing at that kind of rate for all the right reasons, there's not much relief in sight.
No. And to your earlier point, most of our expenses is in personnel, and the highest is police and fire.
Yeah.
Okay, Dan, back to you.
All right. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So moving into the impact on the median valued home, it's worth noting for our analysis, we use a median value of $356,500. So in 2027, based on the levy changes that were discussed on the previous slide, we'd be anticipating about $138 a year, or about $12 a month, and then, or 38 cents a day. 2028 is a little more, as we talked about, so that's about $189, then in 2029, about $172, and then as those levy increases kind of moderate over time, it averages out to about $98 a year through the balance of the projection. And then right now, we spoke with Dakota County and got some preliminary payable 2027 market values. So if we look at the taxable market value, so these are the amounts that are actually used to apply the property tax levy, we can see that about 1.88% overall increase, so right around 2%. That's fairly consistent with what we've included in the models in previous years. We've kind of bopped between 2% and 3% for tax-based expansion over time. And if we look at the estimated market values, this is the total value, that's about 1.71%. So again, generally consistent with what we've been seeing in the model over the past few years. You may recall in some previous iterations of the model, we actually did some sensitivity testing on the tax base and actually looked at 2, 3, 4, 5, I think all the way up to 10%, if I recall correctly, about the base. But generally, we find that you do have years where it goes up a little more, goes up a little less. Maybe there's a little shift in the base, but kind of over time, 2% to 3% seems to be generally what we've seen in price appreciation for taxable and estimated market values.
Big change from a year ago. Residential going down, commercial up, industrial going way down. As a percent increase, sorry, I'm referring to percent of increases. It's a different table every year, but.
There have been some, Madam Mayor, Councilor, there have been some shifts over the last couple of years, especially after we saw the large increases in residential properties after the pandemic. The market has kind of been sorting itself out. And then, of course, the shift to some of the work from home has put pressure on some of the commercial properties. That pendulum seems to be swinging back a little bit now. So there's a little more expansion in the commercial properties. And the residential properties seem to have kind of returned to some of the more typical year-over-year increases we would expect.
Yeah.
So looking at all the overall capital projects, right now about $327 million in projects planned over the next 10 years, so through 2036. That does exclude the $26 million or so in additional costs that is budgeted in 2026 for the Police City Hall project. You may recall that the council made the decision to kind of split the two bond issues for that project, since it was a larger amount and the project was going to take a few years to complete. And so we have recognized kind of some of those costs in different years. It doesn't include any of the utility funds, as I mentioned earlier. And then, in fact, if you look kind of by fund, to build on a previous slide, facilities makes up the really plurality of the projects, $150 million. And in fact, though, if you were to take a deeper look at facilities, which we'll do here in a few slides, but $114 million of that $150 million is actually two facilities, almost $40 million for Fire Station number 2 and $75 million for the maintenance facility, which is that large turquoise bar that you see in 2033. So kind of moving fund by fund, we look at the Infrastructure Trust Fund, just under $21 million in projects planned over the next handful of years. Most of that, almost $20 million for street improvements. It's worth noting that between 2031 and 2036, we have estimated project costs. We put in a placeholder of $5.4 million per year. We're adjusting that by 1.5% annually. The thing I would stress about this slide, and we mentioned it when we were discussing the pending studies, we do anticipate a lot of this to change based on the Infrastructure Trust Fund plan. We do know that the council has heard from your engineering staff about the need to spend really more on the city's infrastructure through this fund. That's a function of both the cost of street projects and a desire to basically replace or tend to more of the system on an annual basis, and that will result in some additional costs. So very much this fund will be a function of all of the excellent planning that the city has done over the last few years. And of course, as you know, once you make those plans and have all those wonderful ideas, the next question that gets asked is how are you going to pay for it? So certainly we would imagine, to reach back to Councilmember Keeley's point, that this fund will look much different probably in the FMP next year after you've completed the Infrastructure Trust Fund plan and made some decisions about how to use these resources to meet the needs of the community.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, just a reminder for you and for the community, we're planning to come back to you in the May work session to present that Infrastructure Trust Fund plan. Work is continuing on that plan to help inform the conversation that Dan has mentioned. If you recall, that plan really came out of our discussion of the pavement management plan about a year ago to start talking about how do we address challenges, again, to Dan's point, related to the ITF, to the Infrastructure Trust Fund, and talk with the council about potentially new strategy around how we might address some of those ongoing funding challenges.
Okay.
So looking at the fund over the next 10 years, it's worth mentioning that the council may recall when the initial decisions were made in 2023 to make significant investments in staff and other projects. The property tax levy that is actually directed at this fund was reduced, and the city actually issued some debt to support some of the projects. And now the city has been loading that property tax levy back in over a few years in order to protect the financial position of the fund. It's a strategy the city has used in the past to meet its needs and respond to property tax pressure. So that will be built back through 2026. It's worth noting that the MSA funds tend to vary, and they've been averaging around $1.2 million annually. That's maybe a little less than what we've seen in previous years, and so that is reflected in the long-term projection. And you can see really in 2027, the fund is actually really right at its fund balance requirement. The council may recall that this fund balance requirement, the $2 million, is actually set by city ordinance. And so that is reflected here as that red line. But generally, the fund is performing okay, given its current cost pressures. You can see that at the end of the 10-year period, although it does dip below the fund balance requirement, it does return above it at the end of the projection, which is always our goal when we're performing a financial management plan. But as mentioned in the earlier slide, there are some additional costs that are contemplated for this fund. And so we do imagine that all of this will change. I would say that it's even possible that the council may revisit the fund balance requirement for this fund in the light of the additional costs that will be considered as a part of the infrastructure trust fund plan.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
this is another
Yes.
example of 1 year makes a huge difference. Last year's presentation only had 2 years, 2021 and 2029, where we fell below the 2 million. In 1 year, we now have almost every year, except for a few, falling well under the 2 million. To Greg's point, we got a serious problem brewing with the ITF.
Yep.
Franchise fees
Not
the
to make
rescue.
it too simple, but things are getting older and more expensive.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
Yeah.
and that is the challenge.
I am too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we all are, you know.
Can relate, Kara.
We're asking for Chili's instead of Chipotle. I mean, that's an upgrade.
So moving to the facilities capital project fund, about $55 million of projects planned between 2027 and 2030. It's worth noting, you see Police City Hall there with a couple asterisks, is $168,000, but again, that's in 2027. That doesn't reflect the current outlays planned in 2026 for the ongoing construction of the Police City Hall project and the remaining portion of the borrowing that will have to occur. So we tend not to look at the current budget year since the financial management plan is forward-looking, but since those numbers are quite material to this fund, it's worth mentioning in our conversation this evening. As I noted in the previous slide, almost $40 million for the fire stations, that those right now are occurring in 2029. I do know in our conversations with city staff that project may have to move a year depending on the operational needs of the fire department. And of course, the council will have conversations about that in the future as both part of the operational discussions related to the department and then the budget process and then of course the planning for the project itself in the near future here. But right now, for our modeling sake, it's still in 2029, which is where it was reflected in previous years and consistent with the council's current plan for the phasing of those three projects, Police City Hall, Fire Station Number 2, and the maintenance facility. But right now, when you look at the Facilities Capital Project Fund, 72% of all of the costs planned through 2030 are for fire-related services. So much to Councilmember Keeley's point earlier about the general fund and most of the costs going to public safety, that also is consistent here over the next handful of years related to facilities.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Okay,
similarities with
Councilmember
that
Keeley.
72%. I just wanted to talk about that shift because of our funding through the franchise fees is on a schedule. BJ, are you looking to move it up a year sooner or push it back a year? From whatever the original plan
Fire
is?
Station 2.
Fire Station 2, the goal was to make it operational in '29, which would mean we need to start construction in '28, which I believe is what we've kind of planned all along. I think it's floated between '29 and '30, but I think all along '29 has kind of been the goal for it to be operational, and now as we start to back into the timeline to make that happen.
Sure. And you referenced 2028, but that's probably from a financial management standpoint, putting the money in place, et cetera, the impacts
And
to
Mayor,
the
council members,
source.
right now, the way the model works is we are showing the outlays in '29, and then the debt service would begin in 2030. So from a financial
29.
perspective, it would be bumped forward a year.
Okay.
But I think to the question you were raising, Councilmember Keeley, the way the capital project fund is currently set up and the fees related to the debt service, those are also proposed to be adjusted when the debt service would begin. So again, then that means the franchise fee adjustments would potentially have to occur a year earlier as well.
Okay.
In order
There
to
you-
make
that's
sure
what I was
that
thinking.
you
Right.
have appropriate cash flow to service the bonds.
Right.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, one of the last conversations the council had had about the facilities funding strategy through utility franchise fees was to potentially consider annual increases to those franchise fees to kind of step into some of these nearer term projects, which then also would kind of change the reality to both payers and the revenue that the city's bringing in. So those are conversations that we're planning on bringing back to the council in the May work session to start reintroducing the Fire Station 2 project and getting the council's direction and on what those next steps and timing should look like.
Did we, just a refresher, did we vote to actually do the steps? That's the way I remember it, but
Yeah.
I.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I have not taken the time to go back and look specifically, so I don't want to give you an incorrect answer. If memory serves, there was at least council direction that was perhaps preferred, but I'll go back and recapture council direction. It's something that I've talked with staff about accomplishing, and we'll get you that information.
Okay. Well, considering it's a funding source, and assuming it does step up every year based on when we anticipated the Fire Station 2, how the police city hall comes out, the funding, where we're sitting, if we have to shift it up 6 months or a year, it may or may not trigger an adjustment in that step-up program. Just depends on how things come out when we get a little bit closer. Right?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, that's a good point. And there are a number of factors to consider when we think about the financing strategy of the Fire 2 project in particular. If you recall, the council did decide to include portions of the design process of Fire 2 in the Police City Hall funding package. So there will be a number of factors for us to consider. Frankly, project performance on the current Police City Hall project is also something that we're going to want to consider over time. Again, that's going to be a matter of timing and how that all works out in terms of where we're at with the project by the time we would go into another project, but clearly factors we'll want to consider in strategy that we'll want to talk with the council about in terms of direction on that.
Thank you. I think for the people watching, wherever they are today, or maybe in the future watching the replay on YouTube or the city the website, I mean, we're really referring to a very, very large project, a Hulk-size capital project that comes around every 40 years. And so I don't want to talk about it as if it's just nothing, right? Or if it's just, oh yeah, it's just here or there type of thing. It is a big project, and it is a significant project to manage from city staff standpoint. Obviously, I have a lot of vendors and third-party resources that are helping manage the project, manage the construction, but it is a lot of burden on the city staff, finance, leadership, to be able to get through something like that. It's a lot different than, pardon me, Mark, with no disrespect, a $2 million road project. This is a $98 million project, and it's very dynamic, and it has 3 phases. It causes disruption to City Hall during the process. And I don't know what our surveys have said, but it seems to me like City Hall has been functioning pretty darn well. I haven't heard a single person say anything about, I'm having a difficult time getting to access to support for. It's like that massive project out there is having no effect on the consistency
services.
and the support that the community is receiving from this building and the people that are working in here. So compliments to that. That's fantastic, because there's a lot of work's been going on the last year and will continue, and obviously affecting PD when they move out of their existing space into some temporary space. That's a big disruption of that department. So I just don't want to sort of refer to this project as if it's just another thing that you do every day or every year. It is extraordinarily unusual. And it is going to set the city up and support our city for the next 4 decades. And it's absolutely the right way to do it. I'm very happy that this was I think unanimous vote to do this. Maybe. But I know that there's unanimous support that it needs to be done.
Yes.
There you go. Is that phrasing
Yes,
it properly?
Thank you. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I think it's an important opportunity to recognize that there are many staff who are putting in a lot of effort to make sure that the community is well served. Customer service, Councilmember Keeley, as an example, is something that we're focused on not only through the transition and the disruption of a very significant, to your point, project happening on this campus, but we're also spending a lot of time thinking about what does customer service and day one operational excellence look like, both on the police and the city hall side of the project, and that's taken an entire team. Also think it's important to recognize that the project team, our construction managers, and our architects have been incredibly efficient and effective on the financial management side of the project. We're on time, we're on budget. A project of this scale, we would anticipate with a $5+ million contingency over the course of a month to potentially spend in upwards of $100,000 in change orders. Right now, after 8 months, we've totaled, after I believe 51 executed change orders on the project, something like $12,000. So there's an incredible amount of efficiency in time and effort that's gone into managing this project well. Clearly, we will have change orders in the project, and we will spend project contingency, but efficiency and effectiveness along with that level of service has been very important and very much a team effort.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great
Dan
work.
Tittner, back to you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So moving into the Facilities Capital Project Fund projection, and I think to the question that was raised earlier, the way this is currently structured, and it's consistent with guidance the council had provided after we completed the franchise fee study, is there are annual increases in the franchise fees and then larger increases in the years that the debt service would come online for the individual projects. And that, I think, to the council's credit, was in recognition of the fact that the fees will have to go up in that year, and by phasing it over a series of years, it's less of a large increase in individual year. It's worth noting that that big gray bar, those are the unspent bond proceeds. So when we look at the end of the year, you did borrow $73 million for the first series of bonds to support the project cost that was mentioned by the city manager, and those are basically held. They'll be spent down, and that's why basically that bar goes away, because you're actively doing the project right now. It just happens to be that you're holding them at year end while you spend down the proceeds over time.
Can I
Yeah.
there's a little difference in a number that I'd like to ask about. Last year, we forecasted the maintenance facility at 80 million, and it's now down 10 million, which is great news. I just want to understand why.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really positive number. Maybe it'll go down more, but I don't know where those numbers came from, and 10 million is a pretty big swing.
Yeah.
Madam
Dan?
Mayor, members of the council, I would have to defer to staff to answer that question.
Okay.
I'm not sure
Jenny?
about the cost change.
As I look at it, it could be in part just recognizing that we will have some additional funds on hand that could go towards that last project, but I would have to look at it. We could
Gotcha,
look more
because
in depth.
this is a bonding number, not necessarily the total project cost number, right? Okay,
Okay.
that makes sense. Well, that's still good news.
Definitely. So Madam Mayor, members of the council, something to keep in mind that right now, if all of these projects were to move forward in the current years, the total debt service that would be supported by the fund and the franchise fees would just be right around $17 million. The other thing to keep in mind is that as we get to 2036, the fund has about $20.7 million in excess fund balance. And you may sit there and ask yourself, well, wait a minute, like there's an extra almost $21 million in the fund. Doesn't the fund have too much money in it? But the thing to keep in mind, and this is something the council talked about when the franchise fee study was completed, is that right now, over the 11 years, so last year when the Police City Hall project began, through 2036, this fund will support $243 million of capital projects. So really, when we look at that additional $20 million, we're talking about less than 10% of the total outlay. And so I think the council made a very purposeful and wise decision to structure the fund, understanding the cost of the projects and the generational impact that they would have, to Councilmember Keeley's point, and the fact that we are trying to look out over a 10-year period. And so we wanted to make sure that there were sufficient resources to meet the needs of the community in the years that they would occur. And the other thing to keep in mind, which is already talked about, is that in order for these blue bars to become reality, the council would have to move forward with each of the projects and finance them with franchise fees and make active choices through individual ordinance actions to adjust those fees. So even though we're making projections over a 10-year period, there are a number of touchstones the council would have to have in order to make this graph a reality. But based on the latest and greatest guidance that we received from the council, both in the last financial management plan and the franchise fee study, which explored 3 different options for this fund, that's what's baked into the model here this evening. Of course, a lot of it can change over the next decade. So
That's
moving
a
into
very good point. I'm glad you pointed out that fund balance being so high in those out years after we've succeeded the support for the 3 major projects that are baked into here. That sort of, when I was looking at last year's chart, because it's a little closer and easier to see than this year's chart, 2035 was showing a little over 25 million. And I'm thinking, okay, we're past, absorbing the cost of the 3rd project by then. That is a substantial balance. So I appreciate the explanation.
And members of the council, and the thing to keep in mind, and it was raised by the deputy city manager, is you could certainly use some of that cash to apply it to projects in later years. There certainly could be other projects that could be supported by the fund, and not to bury the lead, we'll talk about maybe some of that in a few slides. And then, of course, you could always adjust the fees over time to manage the balance requirements, much like you do with the property tax levy.
Yep, thank you.
So we move into the equipment and vehicle fund. Right now, over the next few years, about $8.8 million for fire, $4.3 for police, spending $5.5 million on streets, $3 million on parks, and a few other areas spending about $617,000. And then we have included a placeholder of $4.6 million in the out years, which generally reflect your historical average. Right now, and maybe you may feel a theme building here, you spend about 60% of the equipment costs on public safety needs in this fund. So it is following some of the trends for the other funds that you could see. There's about $1.4 million for a rescue pumper, and then $1.75 million for a fire engine in 2029. When we look at the fund over time, you can see that we are recommending the property tax levy increase 3% in 2027, and then really through the balance of the model a 6% annual increase, and that's to reflect the equipment needs of the various departments. This fund does look maybe a little better on paper right now because there are larger cash balances, and that's generally due to the fact that there is significant lag time between when you order a vehicle and when you actually pay for a vehicle. And so that is reflected in the planning of the fund itself, but not necessarily in this chart. So you may ask yourself, well, we have all these large balances. That's because you're placing orders for things like fire trucks and ambulances sometimes years in advance, and you don't really make full payment on them until you take delivery. The other thing to keep in mind is the fund right now is supported over a 10-year period by more than $9 million in borrowing, and so that's also reflected in the fund as well. $1.4 million for the rescue pumper and ambulance, $1.2 million for a loader and a Class 7 truck, $1 million again for an ambulance and a dump truck, and then in 2029, $2.3 million for an ambulance and a fire engine. Of course, as you'll see kind of over time, we'll have to make adjustments to this fund based on when those outlays actually happen, when those vehicles are ordered, and the borrowing in this fund could certainly change because there are some hard and fast rules around how long you can hang on to bond proceeds. The deputy city manager and I have had many conversations about that, making sure that you're not backing into any problems with any of your tax-exempt financing. So that's really a long way of saying that this fund does have some timing challenges associated with it, given the lead times of some of these vehicles and when they have to be ordered. And of course, the ever-increasing costs of equipment, especially fire apparatuses.
Sorry, I have another
Yes,
question.
yeah. Councilmember Keeley.
I love numbers. This chart last year looked really rough. Like by 2035, the fund balance is basically at the minimum. Yet, 1 year later, the fund balance, it looks like it is dramatically better. And you have the same recommendations of 3% and 6% for the same number of years, and the same potential bonding. What do you think? Did we save money? Did we not buy things or change our mind on some things or change our strategy? Because this chart from 2028 goes all the way down to under 2 million by 2035. And that one drops, but it stays significantly above our recommended minimum balance. So it looks to me like in the last year, our planning in this particular bucket of funds really changed, almost like we didn't decide to buy what we thought we might have thought we might be buying, right?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, as mentioned on the slide, the main difference is the larger cash balances really are those lead times of those vehicles. So when we look at the fund and we look at the financials, we see that the fund has cash in it, but it doesn't have the outlays yet. And in the model, we don't have the carryovers built in. We could certainly go in and adjust all of it, and you would see that these balances would come down because you'd start writing million-dollar checks for the vehicles that you're currently waiting on.
Yeah. So does that mean this chart is legit, or is last year's chart closer to what's going to happen?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, members of the council, it's certainly legit. The challenge really is timing in trying to figure out when these vehicles are going to show up and when the cash will actually leave the fund. We can certainly make adjustments in individual years and make some guesses, but lead time for some vehicles can be 2, 3, 4 years, and oftentimes, although you can make payments right away and realize a discount, the city, to its credit, has done the analysis and figured out that if you hang on to the fund, you can actually earn more in investments than you would take on the discount buying the vehicle right away in full.
Right.
So the nice thing to know, and I think to your point, Councilmember Keeley, is that this one is a little tricky. It's a little difficult to kind of understand what the ins and outs are going to look like in an individual year. But ultimately, from Eller's perspective, the fund is performing well, given the borrowing that is currently anticipated in the fund. Certainly, we could include the encumbrances and the carryovers. It would change things a little bit, reflect more the graph from last year. But ultimately, it's two ways of kind of looking at the fund. This one is more reflecting the amount of cash that it currently has.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it is we're talking material difference, significant material difference.
I'm going to go to Jenny and then to Councilmember Gustafson.
Yeah. Madam Mayor, council members, we also made a change in this fund for the landfill fees that we collect. Previously, we did split them between the facilities fund, parks renovation, and the equipment and vehicle fund. But we did make a change that we made permanent during last year's budget process, where the facilities fund is well funded through franchise fees. And so to kind of bolster both parks and equipment and vehicle funds, we did just decide to split those landfill host fees between those two funds as well.
So equipment and vehicle got a bigger.
They got a bigger share of that
Contribution.
revenue permanently, instead of, I think we initially had done a 3-year kind of temporary fix in the 2025 budget, and then for 2026, we made that change permanent.
Well, there you go, Dan. More money.
Yeah. Well, Madam Mayor, members of the council, to this deputy mayor's point, if I would just read my own notes, I wrote includes additional revenue for host fee agreement and average about $1.4 million annually over the projection period.
Yeah, that's going to dramatically change this chart.
Okay.
And Madam Mayor, members of the council, that was part of the strategy. And I would also say that there has been a significant shift in the past 2 years in the planning, the intentionality of planning, and the thoughtfulness of managing the vehicle and equipment fund most effectively. That's been informed by even recent conversations that we've had here about our fleet study, as an example. And I would say that there's a new discipline in the management of this fund, in addition to the council's direction on different revenue strategy that you're seeing reflected here. And that's not to say there aren't future discussions about this fund. There are still significant challenges when it comes to the city's vehicles and equipment. And frankly, one of those conversations that inevitably we'll need to have more strategically is what is the appropriate amount of debt to be using for this fund in particular. So I believe that this chart, in comparison to what you might see from last year's presentation of the FMP, reflects kind of the first step in managing this fund perhaps differently than we have in the past. And there are still future strategic conversations, at least from my perspective, that I think are going to be important for the city council to discuss over the coming years to really best manage the city's debt strategy longer term.
I
Okay.
agree.
Councilmember Gustafson?
Is that, trying to remember my question now? Just kidding.
Sorry, council member.
So this fund is actually showing committed funds on orders that we've already placed? Is that right, Dan?
I remember as council, that's my understanding, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Correct.
Explains the extra money.
Over the last last couple of decades, I think this fund has had more changes in how we fund it. It's gone through 3 or 4 iterations of how we're going to fund it, right? Shifting from here to there, and now last year we made a decision to give it a healthy boost, and it's now showing up in the fund balance, and maybe that'll stay. Or to City Manager Lindbergh's point, it might change again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the study on equipment and vehicles really help inform a lot of this too.
Yeah.
Additionally, I
Yeah,
think as we
Jenny.
developed the 2025 budget, there was a need to really kind of right-size those vehicle budgets, and it did create a lot of pressure in the fund. I think generally speaking, staff has, as City Manager Lindbergh mentioned, staff has been managing those budgets and being very, intentional about that. And we've had some budget savings too. I mean, not large, but, we're those budgets are right-sized, and so we're not having overages and more unexpected things. We have a better plan for the future. So I think that's also impacting where we're at today.
Yeah, better oversight, better management, better reporting.
And that's delivering real operational results to the community. As an example, we're starting to see, from my perspective, better management of the police fleet, as an example. We're starting to see those replacements happening in more effective ways. We're seeing better use of equipment in the public works operation, not only replacing existing equipment, but thinking differently about what equipment we're replacing and how. And that will lead to a stronger fleet and operational position in our ability to deliver better results across operations.
Okay, back to you, Dan Tinter.
Okay, thank you, Madam Mayor. So moving into parks renovation, the council may recall that I believe it is now a year ago, or 2 years ago, I suppose, as far as fiscal periods are concerned, the city split the parks fund into a renovation fund and an investment fund. So for renovations, right now, planning about $12.3 million over the next handful of years. About $6.3 million of that outlay is really to replace and improve courts, parking lots, and trails, and then about $4.1 million is for playground replacement. So the balance of the fund essentially being used to replace or otherwise maintain park infrastructure that the city currently possesses. We, much like the other funds, include a placeholder of about $2.1 million a year, and we're adjusting that by an inflationary factor annually. Again, that's based on your kind of historical averages. So here, if we look over the next 10 years, a 3% increase in the levy annually. It's worth noting that this renovation fund can be used for any capital projects. We'll talk about the difference in the investment fund in a slide here. But right now, there is no bonding that is currently planned, and the fund does remain above its fund balance requirement for the duration of the projection. In 2028, it does flirt with it a little bit, but it still remains about $168,000 above the fund balance requirement in that year. Much like was mentioned with the vehicle fund, this does also have host fee agreement revenue in it, again averaging about $1.4 million annually over the projection period. But ultimately, no bonding is currently planned for the fund. You may recall from previous iterations, for some projects, there was some bonding that was contemplated, but that hasn't happened now for a few years.
A bit notable, last year we had 7.7 planned for capital. I think it jumped to 12. What was that in your previous slide?
12.3 for the 3-year period.
We added
Or
almost
two
5
4-year
million
period.
in more park renovations, which, for those of us who've taken the park tour over the
Well-
last 10, 15 years, this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We've
Well,
had,
especially,
much like City Hall
Yeah.
we were, you know,
Well, we
we were
hadn't-
aging and
yeah.
outgrowing it and Band-Aiding it and throwing a few million here and there and wasting our money, unfortunately, but we're
Well-
taking care of some way overdue needs in our parks.
well, I like all of the studies that have been done that has informed these decisions, because we really saw, not only visually, but we also saw it in data with regard to our parks and where they were at, all these assets that, and we just made some investments tonight on some of those.
Yes.
Park
It's
improvement.
noticeable when you have 5 or 6 parks all getting full renovations.
Yeah.
It becomes very noticeable. And I don't know when the last time we've done that since I've been sitting in this dais. I
Yeah.
don't remember doing that level, but it was way overdue.
Not any very intentional planning, strategic look at all of these things, from parks to fleet and everything else. To even our, to the earlier points that we talked about, even our personnel. I mean, police have not been full complemented since 2016. And now we do have a full complement in police where we haven't had. And so we're doing a lot of great things, and all of these things cost money, but it's the delivery of service to the community is what's important. We're doing what they expect of us to do.
And Madam Mayor, members of the council, staff deserves a lot of credit for taking the council's vision. We have a robust leading parks plan that we have staff who are now working incredibly hard and collaboratively to implement changes that make a real difference in service delivery and the community experience. You look at several $1 million in change in the Parks Renovation Fund, Councilmember Keeley, to your earlier point, that's significant investment, and the previous investment was significant, but it's because of that plan and the coordinated effort across parks, recreation, public works, parks maintenance, that we're making some very noticeable differences in the system, and that was what the parks plan was intended to do, and that's why we'll keep doing it.
And I want to also thank our community who participated in some of the vision for each of the different parks that are on the books this year, and all of those people that showed up to help plan those parks, remodel and upgrades. So, yeah, it's a good thing.
Another good reminder that over the course of the next 2 years, we'll complete the rest of the system. So there's individual visions for each park as we continue the work of taking care of really what the Parks Renovation Fund is all about, and why we bifurcated these two funds in the first place was to make sure that we were focused on taking care of what we have and how do we manage and maintain the system, not only in short term, but in the long term. And there's still decisions the council will need to make in that regard. But that's, we're already seeing noticeable differences in
Yeah,
the system
and-
experience.
And the two things that came out in the survey that our community really want us to focus on, public safety and parks. Those are the, and we're investing, and we're saying, okay, this is what you really want. But we were ahead of what they had also shared with us during the survey. So,
And a lot of that park equipment was 30 years old, 20 years old, I
Yeah, and
don't
Jared
know.
can speak to that. And
40
this
years old,
evening,
it
you
was-
even made
yeah.
some improvements in how that's going to be placed on concrete. Well, all of the benches and making them ADA compliant so that people can enjoy it, and they have a smooth way of getting to those picnic tables and benches, and so, yeah. Okay, Dan Tinner, back to you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Don't you just love our financial planning, management plan? Because we get into everything and the community gets to experience what we're going through here.
Madam Mayor, as you may have heard me say before, I always like to joke that the budget is about everything, so the conversation can be about anything, which is great. So,
I'm gonna borrow that one.
what's that?
I'll make a note.
There you go. So the Park Investment Fund, this was, as mentioned, separated a couple years ago to really identify the park dedication fee balance. You may recall when we did the financial management planning exercise a few years ago, it was a little confusing because we would have the, as you may have saw in the previous slide, the two bars that showed the dedication balance and the renovation balance, and trying to figure out what was going to be used for what purpose. The staff and the council, I think, made the excellent decision to separate the funds. So only park dedication fees go into this fund, and it's worth reminding that
The last
these
one
they can
was
only be used
23.
for, excuse me, Madam Mayor?
Park dedication, last one was 23. Park dedication, then we don't have park dedication fees to fund the renovation.
Correct, Madam Mayor. So you can actually spend the park dedication fees on renovation activities.
That's right.
I think to the point you're making, and we'll talk about in a second here, the park dedication fees tend to be episodic. You don't get them on a regular basis, and so it can be difficult to fund kind of ongoing needs and improvements to the park system, provided that, of course, they meet the eligible costs. So to that point, they can only be used for the acquisition or development or improvement of parks, recreational facilities, playgrounds, wetlands. They can't be really used for any ongoing operations, maintenance, or regular deferred maintenance. And so ultimately, I think to the point you're making, Madam Mayor, separating them, identifying what monies can actually be used to service the existing park system and respond to the pressure that you were hearing from the community about the desire for improvements in parks and them being one of the top two services of interest of the public. This goes a long way in helping the council understand the financial impacts and the resources you have available to deliver on the plan that was mentioned earlier. So right now, improvements about 161,000, and then some technology and security improvements that are right under 400 grand. We do have a placeholder, much like the other funds, of 200,000 that's adjusted annually. As you can see here, the Park Investment Fund, as mentioned, began in 2024, so you see that beginning balance that came from the Park Renovation Fund. Right now, we are assuming $100,000 in park dedication annually, but to the point raised earlier, there's no guarantee that that will happen in any given year. But we do know that when you have larger developments, they can still pay a park dedication fee. And what we would actually probably end up seeing is larger deposits into this fund in individual years. To kind of recognize that, we have averaged it out as $100,000 year over year, not trying to guess at when some of those larger payments may occur. The thing to keep in mind here, there is a pickleball park project that is currently planned in 2025. Excuse me, that will occur in 2026, but it has not started yet. It is currently at basically a little under $1.2 million. And so you can see in 25 to 26, the fund balance dip a little bit there to reflect that amount. The funds do decrease gradually over time, and then that's basically to reflect that placeholder adjusted for inflation annually does kind of outpace that $100,000 that we've recognized in the fund year over year. But it generally remains stable. This is one of, this fund doesn't generally have a fund balance requirement. We could certainly include it, but again, it doesn't have a lot of activity, it doesn't have a lot of revenue. It's something that you would probably use on a case-by-case basis. It's more of a facts and circumstances funding source.
Councilmember Keeley?
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because I'd like to revive the discussion of back when we got 1.9 million from Waste Management, from the landfill. We talked about different ideas of a capital project that would meet the needs of our community, and one of them that I had put forward was, and I'm not saying this is the only thing I'm interested in, but a futsal soccer facility within one of our parks. We really haven't talked about that for a couple of years. It's sort of fallen through the cracks, or, you know, we've been busy with other stuff, but I would like to have that discussion before we watch that 1.9 million just sort of evaporate into other things. I would like to revisit the conversation of what new amenities do we want to see in our parks, in addition to the pickleball, which is already part of this plan.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, Councilmember Keeley, to your point, the last time that we had talked about additional investments in parks, staff had asked the council to allow us the time to get through 2027 in the parks visioning process, which is kind of the completion of the parks plan. And yes, Councilmember Keeley, to your point, there has been some time since that last conversation, and now, and certainly through 2027. So if the council wishes to entertain a conversation about additional investments in the system, we certainly can do that. Again, my ask or my caution to the council would be allowing us the time to get through the community engagement, the visioning process to
Yeah.
complete the parks planning discussion, to make sure that those investments are going in places long-term that best meet the community's needs. So that work continues, and certainly we would take any direction the council would want to give us on additional investment projects in the meantime.
Are you suggesting that we plan for the discussion sometime in 2027?
Councilmember Keeley, Mayor Council, the current plan is during 2027, we would complete visioning for the remaining parks in the system. So certainly, the council could have that conversation in 2027. It will be late 2027, early 2028. Really the 2028 budget process, right? That we would be better prepared to have those conversations.
All right, I would just like a date certain so we can get our arms back around that. I think we had some robust discussions, and, I know the visioning is going to include, hopefully will include cross-section of our community, and so we get the feedback. I mean, I know from all the research that was done to bring up some ideas on how we could spend that. Parks investment infusion is the idea of the futsal is a reflection of the fact that our diverse community plays soccer. It doesn't play basketball, baseball, to the degree that it did 20 years ago. And so we don't really have.
Futsal and cricket are the ones that we heard about.
Yes. So I just think I want to make sure that we follow through on those discussions from a couple years ago.
Well, it'd be also good to hear from the community in terms of the need.
Yep.
Okay. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So moving into the IT capital fund for the next 10 years, the largest outlay really right now in 2026 is a new ERP system for the city, so enterprise resource planning. It's essentially your financial system. The city has had the same system for quite some time, and a couple years ago, the vendor actually notified the city that it was done selling the system to other clients, which in the world of information technology and software is usually an indication that they plan to stop supporting it in the near future. So as you can see, the large drop between 25 and 26 reflects that almost $3 million for the ERP system. Much like your other technology that touches some of your enterprise funds, there are transfers in from those other funds to help pay for a portion of that, because obviously the water utility, the sanitary sewer utility, the other enterprises, they benefit from that financial system, so they do pay something of a proportionate share. And there are some consistent cost-sharing methodologies the city uses for technology. $4 million in capital projects. Right now, we are planning about a 12% increase in the property tax levy between 2026 and 2028, and then in 2029, through the duration of the model, 6% annual increases to support the fund. And as you can see from the slide, it does basically ride at the fund balance requirement in 27. It does dip then below until about 2031 when it returns above in 2032. The thing to keep in mind here is that the council wanted, it could issue equipment certificates to actually support the software purchase, but ultimately the plan does not include it because, as you can see from the projection, it does build some balances by the end of the projection period in 2036.
Madam Mayor?
Yeah.
This is another case of, I'll show you your chart from last year, where the tail end of that stays flat, but you've got a dramatic spike in fund balance. Is there, from our finance officer, our CFO, is there another change in the revenue or the infusion of source of funds into this fund that is actually fueling that growth in the balance?
Certainly, we knew this fund, has been kind of in the out years, we knew we had some years where the fund balance did dip below what our target is. And so certainly we look to kind of shore up that levy in that fund to make sure it's appropriate. So some of it is just making sure, kind of year to year, making sure that levy is, helping to get us to an appropriate balance, as well as kind of considering the levy as a total, right? So, kind of where do we have some room to make some additional shifts here? We've looked at that in this fund. And I think as far as technology goes, things change a lot from year to year in terms of just, as we look at the CIP for IT equipment, that tends to experience more change maybe than some of our other, longer term assets. And so that can also have an impact. I think as we look forward to the facilities project, certainly some new capital assets are part of this fund, but some are part of the project, and so we've definitely fine-tuned that to make sure none of those things were in our CIP for this fund, to make sure we're not duplicating anything. Additionally, we've taken advantage of some leasing for some of the IT equipment that has really given us some favorable cost benefits as well. So, but I would say definitely as we look at this fund, when we look at year-over-year capital needs and how they shift, they do tend to change more rapidly in this area than they do in any other. So that can happen just as, things shift, so.
Yeah, my concern when I look at this graph is that 28 and 29, and we have Fire Station 2 rolling in, and there's going to be a lot of infrastructure, IT infrastructure that's not only completing this police and City Hall, but also Fire Station 2, and then then we have the maintenance
Yep.
department, which is
Madam
it's going
Mayor,
to come up, and it's in 31 or
Yeah.
so.
Madam Mayor, council members, certainly as we get closer to those project budgets become more refined, but certainly a lot of the technology that's needed for those individual facilities will be part of that budget. I mean, certainly there will be some that will be part of the IT capital plan, but just as we have here in the Police City Hall project, a lot of that new, kind of those new technology needs will also be planned as part of those projects.
Yeah, because just tonight, we also approved capital funding in IT for the water treatment plant and some other work that we're doing with regard to the underground infrastructure.
And, during the budget process, as we look at each fund, so certainly we have this today, but we look at that on an ongoing basis as we prepare the budget. So as we know more, once the year goes on, we know more about kind of where we're ending up with spending. So certainly we balance those levies and those funds to make sure that we're providing adequate funding for the projects.
Yeah, because tonight wasn't a 26 budget, and we're looking into 27. And I see that 28 and 29, we don't have
Yep.
much of a
And those
fund
were,
balance in it.
those years were low in previous ones. They're just a little bit lower in this current projection. And certainly if that trend continued, that would be very concerning, but we also see that we are kind of growing fund balance back
So
after
we
the
have to
five-year
look at
window.
that because Fire Station 2 rolls in 28.
Correct. And
Madam Mayor,
not,
members,
not all of the fire station IT infrastructure will be funded out of this fund. It will be funded out of the project, and
Oh,
that is
okay.
planned as
Okay.
part
Jenny,
of those projects.
Jenny, I think that's an important point, right? Because
Okay.
actually, Mayor, to your question, there's the potential that those large-scale facility projects actually relieve pressure on this fund.
Okay,
As
okay.
opposed to potentially add it. So I think that's an important point.
Okay.
I also think there's a tremendous amount of variability in this fund, particularly in the past in the recent past planning years, as we've identified the need for a finance ERP system, kind of the city's wholesale software system, and a project team works on making incremental and efficient and effective decisions about what that investment needs to look like. So there's the significant kind of previous existing fund balance that yes, we know there's a significant project to invest in, and we're going to invest those dollars wisely, which might dramatically change the even the short-term planning in this fund. So there's some opportunity there too.
Okay, but it's good to know that the project will cover in 28 and 29, Fire Station 1. So it's not coming out of this fund. It's going to be wrapped into the project cost. Okay. Yeah, Councilmember
So I want
Key.
to follow up. I was kind of comparing the two, and much like those other charts where there's a piece of data that's not represented on these charts, it might be very helpful to have a footnote on these, on any new funding changes, that kind of stuff. So when we are looking at over a 2 or 3 year period, there's a rationale or an explanation why. This one is $2 million higher than last year's. It looks as if we're ramping up for something that we're anticipating to spend in 2037 maybe, or 38. Is there an intentional buildup in the balance? Dramatically, 2 million higher than it was just a year ago, planned in these out years. Is there something that we're saving up for?
Yeah, those as in terms of those last 5 years, I don't know that there's any specific thing. We certainly do know that technology, our needs in terms of technology do change. Certainly, as we get closer to that period, if we see we're still building up fund balance and we don't have needs, we would adjust that levy, pressure. So certainly we have time. It's always nice to see it going up rather than going down, because at least we know we have a balanced, plan and that we're able to fund our needs. But even just changes in, as we look at, IT and even what, our IT director presented in the capital plan, cybersecurity and some things are changing quickly, so we want to be able to respond to those as well. But again, as we go out, if we continue to accrue fund balance that we don't need, we certainly adjust those levy.
It's basically following the
projections.
trend of 2021 through 2024 in anticipation of a big expense in 2025. And then we kind of cruise along the bottom there. Then we start building up again, like there must be a purpose for that much money being accrued.
And certainly, we will plan for that, and
Yeah, if there isn't, then we need to adjust it now.
Yep. We can address that. And we knew we were ramping up for this big ERP project. And again, timing, we're really being intentional about, that expense as we go forward. We expected to see the fund balance really take a dive for a couple of years, and it has, we've seen the rebound definitely. So if that continues, we'll adjust that funding downward if we don't need it. Or if there are other identified needs, those will come through in the capital plans.
The other recommendation I would make is what I'm doing tonight is something that I do as a practice in business. And I think I've always liked doing this, like having last year's, and I've done it a few times. Sometimes it's hard to find, last year's chart and be able to follow along. I appreciate, Dan, that you're actually putting a presentation together that is consistent from slide to slide, like what each slide in the order that you have them is following along with last year. So that kind of continuity is very helpful for us when we're looking at it and trying to find out why certain things look the way they do, right? Or why did the forecast change so dramatically in just 1 year? But it would be nice to actually have that in the presentation, like the past 2 years, so we can see some sort of trend line. It could be just smaller charts below, your main chart for the current year, but then it would, visually, you'd see what I'm seeing, and you'd ask the same questions that I'm asking.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I understand the request, Councilmember Keeley, and I think it's important to remember that the FMP, much like the budget, is a snapshot in time.
Yeah.
There are significant and dynamic changing factors that happen, so certainly we maintain those presentations. They're available on our budget landing page. And some of the comparative conversation absolutely is helpful, and those significant changes make that apples to apples comparison a bit challenging, particularly in the nuances of particular funds. So we can look at what some of that comparative analysis might look like for us, but I think there's also potentially a challenge in year over year, just comparing the FMP at a point in time. And Dan, you might be able to help me out more with that, but just a thought by way of comparison from my perspective. Yeah.
Dan Tintner.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, members of the council, yes, the presentation is a snapshot in time, and we make a series of assumptions, and they change year over year. We can certainly include some more information about what has changed, perhaps significantly, maybe some bullet points from year to year, if there are large changes. Multiple graphs, we've attempted it in the past. The slides tend to get very busy, very difficult to follow. There's a lot of information. Sometimes they can actually serve as just a distraction from the conversation of the evening. So I think the point's well taken that the city now has a rich history of these projections, and we can talk a little bit more about what we were anticipating and how some of that has changed. And I think we can put some thought into how the presentation could be modified to meet that goal. I wouldn't want to go so far, and this is just my knee-jerk reaction, as to trying to put like a side-by-side comparison to each slide. I think that could be pretty challenging and really quite unwieldy. I know I have worked with clients in the past where we would just furnish the copy of the last year's presentation as a part of the materials, so you would have it handy in much the way you have it now.
Yeah,
I think there's a few different ways we could kind of try to figure that out.
okay. Well, I think, I'm not looking for small nuances. There's a lot of adjustments that are pretty minimal. I'm just looking for the dramatic ones where there has to be an explanation as to why the forecast, in this case, has a fund balance of $2 million higher than it was just a year ago, what we thought it was, right? So there's a reason for that, and it's a big enough number that it's substantial and material and should have an explanation, from my perspective.
Yeah, Mayor, members of the council, I agree. I think we can include some of that when we have kind of large deviations in the way that you're describing, that are either in the dollar amount significant, or perhaps even as a percentage of the fund's activity significant.
Yeah.
So moving into the cable franchise fee fund, so the council has certainly seen this one before. As we know, with the cord-cutting phenomena, the cable franchise fees have been decreasing over time, and we've in fact been modeling a decline of about 4.25% annually. The council may recall that in 2023, and actually to help stabilize this fund, the city allocated about $500,000 per year in personnel costs away from this fund to the general fund. And even that adjustment over time has not been enough to save it from the downward trend of its revenues. So when we look at this one, this slide's a little different. That orange line is not actually the fund balance requirement. It is the transfers in and out of the fund from this fund to the general fund. And you can actually see in 2027 to 28, it actually dips down, and the general fund starts having to transfer money into the fund in order to maintain the solvency of it. And in fact, when we add it up over the entire duration of the fund that's reflected on this chart, from 2022 to 2036, it's actually about $1.6 million of transfers in from the general fund. And so ultimately, the city will really have to consider the best way to handle this fund. You certainly have to segregate the monies into a separate fund because you are getting them for a legally restricted purpose, but it's probably at some point in time the city will have to consider ultimately having the general fund take on more of these activities or modifying the operations that are supported by the fund itself. Because really once you get into the point where you're just transferring year over year into a fund from the general fund, that really is now a general fund expenditure.
Yeah.
And you should really save yourself the accounting hassle, and ultimately, the operation of the fund becomes less transparent to someone that were to pick up your financial statements and try to figure out what's going on with this fund and why. You've got a little time to figure it out. It's not to say that you have to do it right now, but ultimately, you will have to settle this fund every year in cash anyways, so you should make some changes to it.
Yeah, because
given what
this
we've seen.
graph really represents what's happening right now in comparison to last year's graph.
Yeah, it's just got worse.
Yeah, well,
Than last year.
we're seeing the decline in, because there is a lot of competition out there with regard to cable.
Streaming.
We don't have a
And there
peg
are
fee
other-
for the streaming
Streaming,
devices.
no.
Yeah,
But ultimately, the goal was just to maintain a stable balance over time. That's why that blue bar doesn't change. So it's just a static amount, and then the transfers in and out of the fund just become a function of maintaining that fund balance.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
I think it's inevitable.
And we believe that's a reasonable plan right now
Yeah.
for this particular fund.
yeah. Well, we're.
There will be
This one
future
really
challenges.
tells the story. Tonight's graph tells the story of where we're at with cable franchise fees.
And Madam Mayor, members of the council, I certainly don't want to make light of several $100,000, but if you look at this graph compared to some of the other ones, the scale we're dealing with here is significantly less than some of the
Yes,
other
pretty
funds.
small.
So while it certainly is a, quote-unquote problem in terms of how the fund is operating, financially, it is not as consequential as the other funds that we're talking about this evening, but still something
True.
bringing it to the attention of the council, because you will have to make some adjustments to it likely in the near future.
Just to note, our forecast for the last year was, all the way out through 2035, was to keep 400,000 in. And there were transfers about the same time to keep it there. Now you see it, we dropped down to about 170,000.
Yeah,
Just to maintain that balance, we have to feed it.
yeah.
And part of that ends up, Madam Mayor, members of the council, ends up being a function really of the overall property tax levy, because those general fund transfers are coming from your general fund reserves, and then we need to adjust the levy in order to make sure you're maintaining those reserves at the appropriate amount set by the council, as we talked about earlier in the presentation. So as you move money around, it does have tails all the way back to the property tax levy.
Yeah.
Okay, moving into some of the enterprises, the ice arena over the next 10 years, its operating revenues are currently covering its operating costs. I think as we've shared with the council in the past, we do these for a number of communities that have ice arenas, and that's not always the case. Sometimes they do have an operating subsidy. We are still recommending that the fees increase 3% annually, basically to maintain the position that it still covers its operations. But the thing to keep in mind is that it is supporting about 1.1 million of its own capital projects, but the franchise fees and the facilities capital project fund are supporting about $1.8 million of capital projects over the next 10 years. So while the fund is performing well from an operating perspective and is still able to make significant investments in its needs to the tune of about $1.1 million, it's still getting the better part of $2 million from another funding source. And so ultimately, if you were to try to operate this fund as its own enterprise, it could not support its operations and its capital over time. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Many communities look at these facilities much like they do parks and understand that they'll have to make an investment in them in order to make sure that they operate and meet the service level expectations that are expected by the council and demanded by the community that uses the facilities. The thing to keep in mind is that the drop in the working capital between 28 and 29 is due to a main office renovation of about $117,000, and then there's some additional flooring that will happen in that year. That's about $500,000. But much like we see in funds, and you've seen in some of the other capital project funds, it's not uncommon when you have larger outlays to go through a few years of savings, followed by some spending, and then a few more years of savings. And so you can see here, the fund spends it down, and then accrues some capital, and then would likely then spend it down again in a future year. It's also possible that if you wanted to, with some of those out-year reserves or working capital amounts, you could potentially have the fund pick up some more of its capital activity, some of that $1.8 million that's currently supported by the facilities fund. Potentially, the fund could take a little more if you wanted to. It really depends on the individual project, the year, and of course, as the financial position changes over time. When we look at the Ames Center, This is similar to the conversation we had last year with the council. The operating revenues currently do not cover its costs. We are assuming annual fee increases of 5% a year, and we are aware that the naming rights decreased to $50,000, down from $150,000 beginning in 2029. There are currently about $800,000 in capital projects that are supported by the fund. But again, much like the ICE Center, there's about $3 million in capital projects that are in fact supported by the Facilities Fund. The large drop between 2026 and 2027 in terms of the ending cash is related to lighting conversion in the facility. That's almost $600,000. The other thing that I would mention, and I'm sure the council is aware, but that currently any outstanding debt service related to this fund is actually supported by the property tax levy and not supported by the enterprise itself. And between 2026 and 2027, there's about $3 million in debt service remaining on those bonds. Those bonds do mature after 2027. But between the current capital projects that are planned for the fund over the next 10 years and the current debt, there's about $6 million that is being supported by other sources outside of the fund itself. And so ultimately, given the ending cash position and as it decreases over time, the city will either have to identify additional funding sources or consider operational changes to the Ames Center, or it may even have to say that the additional capital projects that are currently supported by the Ames Center Fund, in fact, need to be supported by the Facilities Fund. So when we talk about some of those excess, quote-unquote, excess fund balances in the franchise fee fund, the Facilities Fund, that could potentially be used to support some of the costs that are in these enterprises, both in the Ames Center and in the golf course, which we'll talk about in a second here.
Yeah, Dan.
What's the reason for the drop to 50,000 in the naming rights? Which one is falling off or ending, I guess? Do you know?
Madam Mayor, council members, it's the $100,000 from Ames. I think that is scheduled in 2028 is the last year we have an agreement with them. So that,
Which one, from the first $1 million or the second
the
500?
second
The second 500?
agreement, yep.
And then the other, last year we had 2 million in capital and 4.3 from Capitals Fund. That dropped to 803 million, so pretty big drop. Did we finish about $1 million in capital projects between last year and this year for that number to drop from 2 million to 800,000?
It could be, I'd have to look, but it could be some of those that we finished. Some may have shifted over to the Facilities Fund, or just timing changes could happen. So there is some shifts that happen in capital as a result, but we do look at the types of capital expenditures and what might be appropriate for the Facilities Fund and what is more appropriate for the Ames Center Fund. So there is some changes that do happen.
It's
too.
like both of them went down. I first thought maybe it was just a shift, right, out of the capital into the Facilities Fund, but the facilities was 4.3 million, it's dropped to 3 million. Capital expense or capital projects was 2 million, now it dropped to 800. So it just seems like a lot of stuff got removed per se, or completed. Right?
It's a combination, I would say. Things get completed. We also take a look at the condition of the assets and prioritize, hey, what every year, sometimes there are shifts and this, something may, decline in condition faster than something else. And
Sure.
so we do take a look at that to make the best use of funds that we can.
Did we have any big projects with the capital, with Ames in the last year? Was like the roof or something needed to be replaced that was probably around $1 million?
The most significant project, at least off the top of my head, is HVAC equipment, chillers.
Yeah.
Am I correct about that?
There was some HVAC. I'd have to look at the list. I don't know if Finance Director Ryan remembers.
We'd have to take the look at the list, but we're always rebalancing the projects based on the funding available as well. So there was a lot of rebalancing the projects between the years, especially with the facilities study being finished and some other things about what all the funds across the board can handle.
Gotcha. I understand that from my HOA board days. of shifting that 30-year capital projects around. Each year, you kind of adjust a few things. Thank you.
Moving into the golf course, the current operating revenues cover, but again, much like the other two funds, there's quite not enough for capital needs, so we have assumed an annual fee increase of 6% annually. There's about $1 million in capital project that this fund is covering. It does not include about $426,000 in funds supported by the Facilities Capital Project Fund. It's worth noting that that includes $180,000 for irrigation improvements in 2026. And so, much like the Ames Center Fund, you may either need to increase the fees, subsidize it more at the property tax levy, or assign more of the capital projects from this fund to the Facilities Capital Project Fund. But it does have some challenges. The nice thing here is it does start to rebound in 2036 as those 6% year-over-year increases in the fees for the golf course compound on each other. So there is a little bit more of a turnaround in this fund. But over the next decade, its capital requirements, it essentially can't fund them to meet the working capital thresholds for the fund itself.
What does a round of golf cost by 2036 at a par 3?
That's exactly what I was thinking. What is that? When is that going to hit that point where people are going, this is getting so expensive, I may as well go to Legends? I mean, that's a bad comparison, but.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I'd actually have to look at the worksheet to see what the amount is.
We
I
could,
don't need an exact number, it was just
No.
metaphorical.
6% year over year it's going to climb over the next 10 plus years. And it's a small municipal par 3 course, so I'm not sure what our base starting is because I haven't played there. But that could get spendy, and I wonder what kind of community pushback we'll see with that kind of hike.
And Madam Mayor, members of the council, to that point, you could certainly, as was discussed earlier with this slide, consider moving some of those capital projects that are currently supported by the fund to the Facilities Capital Project Fund, and then it wouldn't need to raise as much revenue in order to have the working capital necessary. Because right now, just covering its operations just can't support the capital projects that are currently planned in the fund. So if you were under the theory that the public would become price sensitive at a certain point over time, there is something of an off-ramp that the city could realize with the facilities fund, much like it already is doing. It would just be more of a shift to that fund. And we do know right now in the long-term projection, the facilities fund does have the capacity to take on those additional costs. But again, that would require council direction.
Thank you.
I would also add to that, as we get into the budget process, individual budget preparers are analyzing their fees and taking a look at, what are other cities doing, what's the market for that, and so certainly we take that into account as we set fees during the budget process.
So moving into the EDA fund, over the next 10 years, we have $700,000 in the property tax levy in 2026, and then we're planning to increase it $50,000 every year starting in 2027. So right now, the fund accrues balances primarily because it's only supporting about an annual operating budget of around $300,000. This is intentional on the part of the council, really trying to provide the resources for the EDA to be a more active project partner and giving you the reserves necessary to realize some of your strategic goals related to economic development. Primarily, if the city were ever to want to acquire certain parcels in the community and take a more active development role. The council may recall there have been discussions in the past about acquiring certain parcels and having the city be more the driver of certain developments, or at least to put you in a position to have a say in the development that would occur. But in the past, the city did not have the resources to do so. So it would either have to use other funds or potentially borrow money in order to acquire property. And so this plan right now, and the financial management plan, really helps the city accumulate the reserves necessary to make those decisions. Because as you know, in the world of real estate, oftentimes you have to make decisions very quickly. You don't have the opportunity to wait years to have resources build. And so this puts you in a much more advantageous position over time. And it also puts you closer to some of your peers in terms of the economic development resources that you would have available to realize your strategic goals. The one thing to keep in mind is this currently doesn't include any new program costs. So if you were to use some of these resources for ongoing operational needs, new programs, of course, the fund balances would go down over time as you accumulate additional costs to the fund. But right now, given those planned levy increases, it would increase about $8.2 million in fund balance between 2027 and 2036. And then potential bonding, we've talked about this kind of piecemeal across each of the individual funds and some of the discussion earlier in the presentation. The thing to keep in mind is that right now of the $157 million in borrowing, $131 million is for facilities. And this chart actually doesn't include the $73 million that the city issued in 2025 for the first tranche of funding related to the City Hall project. Really outside of those facilities projects, there's relatively modest borrowing needs over the projection period. So the city is managing its costs well across equipment, streets, infrastructure, and facilities. The thing to keep in mind when we look at the improvement construction fund borrowing, we didn't talk about that fund specifically this evening, but it does show up in your borrowing plans because the city does borrow the special assessment portions of those projects as you extend financing to property owners that use the assessment approach for their portions of the project. And then, as I mentioned, we are currently showing the borrowing and the costs related to Fire Station Number 2 in 2028, into 2029, but that could move to 2028 pending further discussions of the council with respect to that particular project. So again, just a reminder, we kind of started here with the impact on a median valued home as we work through each of the individual funds, and you've seen the individual property tax recommendations, and again for 2027 would be about $138 increase. The thing I would actually note is that a good portion of the increase is actually attributed to the increase in the value of the underlying property. If you in fact held the property's value constant, the increase would be about $79. So some of it is, of course, attributable to the increase in the value of the residential homestead, not just the action the council takes with respect to the property tax levy. And so I always think that's important to note. Of course, they still have to pay it regardless of the source, and so but I do like to point that out, that there would be some increase as a result of the increase in the value of a property. So in 2028, again, $189, 2029, $172, and then as the property tax moderates, $98 a year on average. Again, the median valued home we were using was $356,500. So in conclusion, the FMP update responds to the strategic direction of the City Council. I think as the Council has talked about this evening, many of the plans that have unfolded over the last so many years have now been incorporated into the financial projections of the city, and those are all designed to respond to the needs of the Burnsville community, but then also allow the city to protect its financial position both now and into the future. And as you know, some of these issues took years to address, and from a financial perspective, it can take years to handle them as well, and I think that's reflected in the plan as you see year over year some of the impacts of the decision making. And really trying to balance the financial needs and strategic priorities. We would note the non-binding property tax levy change that ends in 2027, and there is limited property tax support for the debt that's currently included. Most of it, as mentioned on the previous slides, is related to facilities, and that's supported by your franchise fees and your facilities capital project fund, not your property tax levy. And as always, we say that you should monitor the various balances of the fund over time and update the financial management plan on a regular basis, which of course you already do. And as some of you know, I am now a new father. Our daughter is 7 months old. And so I have been very interested in the caffeine content of various beverages as I deal with an infant overnight.
So
in
has
case
Mike
you were ever
been
wondering,
interested in caffeine content.
and he needed a little jolt.
Last year, you were interested in regional giraffe patterns.
Yeah, giraffe patterns.
I'm not, now, that was before your daughter was born, so
Yes.
I'm wondering, who was the giraffe interest party?
So that one actually came from an article I actually read about interesting graphs and infographics, and that one was on there, and I thought, I do find this interesting, I'll share it.
Yeah.
Now, it's worth noting, since I do have a young daughter, I may return to giraffes in the near
I
future.
know,
We'll
I
find
thought
out.
this would
gonna say,
be pretty
Yeah.
fitting
it
of this year.
works.
Yeah, the giraffe pattern was, yeah,
It's the pattern on of the giraffe's skin, fur, coat, whatever, right?
They're all
Different
different.
parts of
in,
Africa,
in
they have
different parts of Africa.
patterns, yeah.
Yeah,
So
from
I didn't know that.
Angola all the way to,
I had friends that would brew coffee with caffeinated water.
say that again, a coffee
They would
with,
use
good
caffeinated
idea.
water as the water to brew the coffee.
where do you get
Boost the
caffeinated
caffeine
water?
From 80 grams to
You can
100.
Oh,
get
you
it.
buy caffeinated water.
Oh, boy, am I behind.
Oh, yeah.
I was gonna
Look at-
suggest a
So,
nitro
Mike-
high-rise with an extra shot at
Mike,
Caribou
you
is
were talking about
been my go-to for many years.
the amount of
keep that in
caffeine
mind.
that was in
Tastes
the
good.
beverage that you were interested in?
Yes, at Caribou, yeah, it was like, what was it,
There's no way it's that
200?
many.
Was it 200 or
Two
300?
95 and like a latte.
If memory, it's good timing, because if memory serves, it was like over 300,
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well,
which puts
Panera,
it like wildly off the chart, so
Yeah.
maybe Dan should try it.
I mean, I'm. Don't do it. Mike's chart, what he was interested in is a lot stronger than what you have here.
Well, I can give it a shot next year and give the jitteriest financial management plan
Yes.
presentation
Well,
ever.
that's what I said when he
Vibrating.
told me, I said, oh, my God.
What is at the top? I can't read it from here.
That's a Jolt Cola.
Jolt, Jolt.
do they still sell that?
Good old Jolt.
I don't know.
Jolt and tobacco.
Yeah. Well, you and Mike are right on the same zone of, with these caffeinated beverages.
Although I do have to say, when asked if they do sell it, I really want to be like, Mayor, members of the council, we can get you that information after the meeting.
Okay, is there anything else? Well,
No, I got all mine out
Thank-
during the presentation.
yeah, thank you, yeah. Thank you, Dan Tintner, thank you, Jenny, thank you, Greg and team. You know, and just going through all of the presentation of the FMP today, I see the influence of all of the studies that we have made. So congratulations in getting all of that going. It truly has informed what we're seeing and what we need to continue to do. So thank you very much, and to members of the council, I mean, and it's nice to go back, since you picked up on the FMP from 2024, I pulled it up also, and it was nice to follow through what went on last year and what we're experiencing this year, and to see the difference. So, thank you. Anything else? Well, we stand adjourned by acclamation, and thank you very much, Greg and staff and Dan, for your work and contributing to help us.